Well, friends, before we begin this episode of CMDA Matters, I wanted to take a moment and give you an update on our region of the U.S. since the recent catastrophic floods of Hurricane Helene hit our area. As you might be aware, CMDA's headquarters are in East Tennessee, which was one of the areas hardest hit by severe flooding. We're very fortunate here at CMDA that our local community in Bristol was not hit hard by the storms in terms of flooding, but we were only a short distance away from some of the most impacted communities here in East Tennessee and Western North Carolina. Actually, some of our CMDA staff members have extended family who've lost their homes, and we know that there are also CMDA members who are facing months ahead while they're trying to restore the damage that's happened. We're grateful for partners like Samaritan's Purse, and their headquarters are in Boone, North Carolina, and they're actually on the ground there. They were hit hard, but they're working hard to provide relief and cleanup efforts. If you're interested in learning how you can help the communities in Southern Appalachia, we've compiled a list of local churches as well as organizations in our area that are accepting donations and coordinating volunteer efforts. You can find that information on CMDA's social media pages. We know our God is faithful, Jehovah Jireh. So thank you for praying for our community that He will take care of the people of this region's needs when they've been hit so hard.
You're listening to CMDA Matters, the weekly podcast of Christian Medical and Dental Associations. Here's your host, Dr. Mike Chupp.
You know, one of my favorite things about hosting this weekly podcast is I get to share with our listeners, like you, about the world of CMDA and all the various ministries that fall under the umbrella of CMDA, engaging our members and champions in Kingdom of God work. We hear so often from people that CMDA, it's rather broad and it's hard to keep track of everything that we do, and you're right on target there. Today's interview is a wonderful opportunity for you to discover one of the ministries of CMDA, because I'm going to be talking to Dr. Don Middleton, who's one of the leaders within CMDA's Addiction Medicine section. He's here with us to share his own personal journey through addiction and how God redeemed his life and his career after he surrendered to Christ. Keep on listening, and you're going to learn more about Dr. Don Middleton. Well, today on CMDA Matters, I get to welcome to the microphone Dr. Don Middleton, who got his medical training at Western University of Health Sciences in Los Angeles, and then for 25 years was involved in private practice in family medicine in Glendale, Arizona. And then after a quarter of a century, God took him in a different direction for a number of reasons, and that is into the arena of addiction medicine. And he's now been working at a quite famous addiction medicine center called Meadows Behavioral Health Campus in Wickenburg, Arizona. He's been married for over 30 years to Tracy, who's also in medicine, and they enjoy the opportunity to serve in medical missions, have been to Kenya and Mexico, and is dad to 4 amazing kids and grandpa to 3 grandkids. And he's the chair of our addiction medicine section, actually at CMDA, and felt led that he should write a book on the famous 12 steps from AA, or Alcoholics Anonymous. So welcome to CMDA Matters, Don. I've been anticipating this conversation for about 3 months now.
So have I, Mike. It's so great to be here and virtually with you.
Well, our listeners should know that it wasn't that long ago, actually about a month ago, that we weren't virtual. We were together here in Bristol. You were in our studio, and one of 12 trainees for our annual media training. So maybe briefly talk about what that was like, media training here at Bristol, so maybe some of our listeners will want to follow your footsteps.
Yes, actually, that was a lot of fun. It was a tiny bit nerve-wracking, but just on the right amount, because it helps you sharpen your skills and talking to people and And if you're especially working in a ministry, it helps you sharpen your messaging for different levels. And while it was a tiny bit anxiety productive, it was really, really supportive, and I felt like I got a lot from it.
Well, you were a star pupil. I think that Mandy, who directed that, would agree with that. Well, before we jump into a discussion of your book, which is entitled The Dunamis Effect, When Your Higher Power is Jesus, obviously a labor of love, how did a Christian doctor like Don Middleton find himself in a prestigious addiction recovery facilities called Meadows Behavioral Health, doing ministry there as a second career?
Well, the truth is that in addition to my biology and nutrition and doctor's degrees, I also have what I call a PhD from the School of Hard Knocks. Like many people, tried alcohol at a football game Friday night in high school and found that made me feel kind of normal. And so I kept doing it until where finally I got to where I couldn't not do it. And I went down a path of addiction that it threatened my life, it threatened my marriage, and threatened my family and my career, until finally God had put me with a woman that finally called me on it and said, things are going to change, or things are going to change. And so I reported myself to the State Board of Medical Examiners as an impaired physician. It was a very vigorous but loving program where they monitored me for 5 years and got me down a path where there was a lot of sobriety. I had to go inpatient, and I had to do counseling and psychiatry and all that. But there was a very healthy dose of going to AA and turning in logs for those too, where I was introduced to these 12 steps. And it's such a blessing I can't keep it to myself. I have to share it with other people.
So I'd love our listeners to hear. I come to those regular things that you have to fill out for your licensure and renewal and stuff like that. Would you have to say that you're impaired or have any addictions? And I'm like, oh boy, what would happen if I tick this box? Yes, ever. So it sounds like that was actually quite a positive and constructive thing for you to decide to do. What would you say to our listeners who come to that checkbox and wonder, I do have some issues, but should I check it or not?
It's a little different in every state. Every board is run differently. But my experience with other people across the country is that, especially if you report yourself, there is an abundance of grace given to them, and you get to usually stay anonymous. So the board of directors, I would go to conferences with those people, and they had no idea they were monitoring me. They just knew that 49333 had negative urine tests, and so he was in compliance. And as part of it was actually kind of funny. I got halfway through my monitoring, I got appointed to the State Board of Medical Trustees. So I was monitoring the board that was monitoring me, and they had no idea. Yeah, they had no idea. I would say that if a person is scared of it, I understand why, but you should be way more scared of untreated addiction.
Well, you tell the story in your book that you had a sponsor to whom you say a million thank yous isn't enough, and I don't know if that you also call that person your recovery partner, but how did he get into your life?
Once I reported myself, they said, you have 3 days to report to rehab. And the day before I went to an AA meeting, and I confessed to the group that that's what I was about to do, is go to rehab. And he picked up a AA Big Book and wrote his name and phone number in it and handed it to me. I had no idea, but I'm sure he had the experience to understand that they were going to take every phone and everything, and I wasn't going to have any phone numbers except his, because they let me keep a big book and a Bible, and that was it. And so I got a 5-minute phone call every night, and I called my wife, and then I got back in line and I called him every night, and he became my sponsor that way.
You were motivated at some point. How long ago did you start on this project, the Dunamis Effect?
Well, when COVID came around, there were 1,600 AA meetings in Phoenix every week.
Wow.
And they instantly evaporated. Right when people were losing their jobs, their kids were home, their gyms were closed, they couldn't go to church. So it was stress, and their stress relievers were taken away from them. And so it was just this perfect storm of relapse ready to happen for a lot of people. And I went to my church. I go to one of the big mega churches here in the valley, and they're wonderful people, but I knew they didn't have any recovery program. And it kind of secret shopped them. And I said, "Hey, I got a problem with alcohol." I was 5 years clean by then. And I said, "What do you got?" And they said, "Well, why don't you go to AA?" And I went to the head pastor and said, "Hey, good job on the soccer team, but that's not a good answer right now because that doesn't exist." And he said, "Well, it's very complicated and it's tough for us to get our arms wrapped around. Why don't you fix it?" And I said, "No, I'm here to complain and I'll put money in the plate and you guys fix it." And he said, "It just doesn't work that way. It's your vision, so it's your mission, so get on it." And I'm not an author. I sat down at a keyboard and asked God to use me as his instrument. And I would get up an hour later and there'd be another chapter. And I have friends that say they've been writing books for 12 years. And, it took me about 3 months to write a book. And then, a couple of months of editing and all that kind of stuff. It was really not me. It was God's work.
Well, for a 90-year-old program, which is AA, I would guess that a few people from time to time along the way have looked at the big book and wanted to maybe thought about a project like you have done. Are there other books out there over the last 70 or 80 years like this, or is this the first of its kind?
No, there's other programs that proudly, announce that Jesus is their higher power. The one that people would probably know the most is Celebrate Recovery.
Mm-hmm.
That was done by the Saddleback people in California. And it's a great program. It had some problems. It requires that they use a worship service, and that wasn't going to work during the pandemic either, So I made this program so it could be pared down to one person that has a problem, one person that's been there and done that, and a book. And you've got a recovery ministry. So it would work for tiny little churches or people that weren't even in church.
So what inspired this Greek word to be used as your title, Dunamis, which I was familiar with? I took a little bit of Greek in undergrad and then chose for my life and ministry verse 2 Timothy 1:6-7. And God's not given us a spirit of fear, but of power, dunamis, and love, agape, and a sound mind, which is a much more complicated Greek word. But this dunamis, in the book you write, hundreds and hundreds of times it's found in the Greek New Testament. But how did that come to be your title?
Well, I originally had a title called Him and Them, Love God and Love Your Neighbor, right? And it was very clever, I thought. And then confused people have pirated personal pronouns, and that didn't work anymore because then it sounds like a guy in transition. And pastors weren't going to look at a book that was him and them. And so some smart people around me that know about publicity and ministries said, let's rename it, let's rebrand it. We did some searching and found dunamis, and it's used so often in the New Testament when Jesus heals somebody that we thought, this is the perfect word, And then when we looked into it, we realized almost no one's using this word, and so it's available on all platforms exactly like it is. So we all kind of had an aha moment that maybe God's been saving this word for this ministry.
So how many people who oversee AA programs across the country, or in particular there in Arizona, come at it from a really non-faith secular perspective, and how do they do that? Because it's so clearly this has arisen from Judeo-Christian principles, very, very biblical kind of principles, which you point out very well in your book.
Well, the second A is anonymity, and so it would be impossible to know what people have. The original wording was God as we understand him, meaning the God of the Bible. But that has morphed over the decades into God as you understand him, meaning whatever God you want. And they chose wording like that for a reason. And it allows people that have church hurt or atheists to come into the rooms and listen and get sober. But over the decades, the Christian roots of this program, as society has become more secular, so has AA. When I say AA, I mean Narcotics Anonymous and Gamblers Anonymous, all the anonymi.
Uh-huh.
But it's become more secular. And interestingly enough, the success rate has gone down over that time, too. The historians will tell you that the early AA had about a 70 to 75% success rate. And nowadays, when it's very secularized and humanized, it's about maybe in the single digits, maybe 7 or 8% success.
Wow. That's incredible. So has anybody awakened to that fact? And surely some people have said, well, we got away from our roots, and that's why we're having greater recidivism or just lack of success.
They're very resistant to changing in AA, and they don't have strong centralized leadership. They've decided to keep each group deciding with its what they call group conscience the way it'll run. And in a lot of them, you just, saying Jesus out loud gets you looked at sideways eyes like, oh no, is he going to evangelize to us? And in some of them, I've even had people like come up to me afterwards and say, we don't do that here. And so I got tired of that. I said, I want a group where I'm allowed to say what my higher power is, because you can say Buddha all day long in AA, but say Jesus and you're going to get some hairs up on the back of people's necks. So.
Well, in our radically independent Western culture, I can see how that has evolved. But I know that AA exists globally. In fact, where I lived for 20 years in Southwest Kenya, there were a number of AA groups scattered across multiple towns, cities there in Kenya. And I'm guessing that it's much easier for those Judeo-Christian biblical roots to stay strong in those places than it is here in our where we worship the idol of autonomy.
Yeah, there are places, and there's places in the United States where people wear Jesus on their sleeve a little easier. Like I was in New Orleans the other day, and gosh, there was the waitress would evangelize to you at the coffee shop, and so there's some places where people feel more comfortable sharing their faith than others. But definitely in certain countries, like Kenya is a very strong Christian area, even though there's a Muslim component to that country. There's a lot of Jesus in Nairobi, and we're starting up some groups there. We have several rehabs that have been using the book already, and so last time a group went over, I sent a couple dozen books and workbooks with them.
So how common is the knowledge of AA and its 12 steps out there, do you think, especially among primary care? As a general surgeon, I knew about AA, but I can't say that I could have said, oh yeah, the steps are surrender, hope, faith, courage, humility, etc., all these biblical words. So would you say that the average American primary care doc of whatever specialty is aware of and sends patients to these AA groups?
Oh, I'm sure they do. They might not know what the steps are, but they know that AA is kind of baked into our culture. It's on TV and it's in movies and it's, part of our culture now. And doctors know that they can use medicine, but they don't have the time and the energy to provide social support and community support to individuals. And that has to come elsewhere. And group meetings are a good place to do that. The interesting thing was I had sent hundreds of people to AA before I ever walked through the doors the first time. So, I didn't know what the steps were, but I walked in and it said God, 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 God on the steps, and I went, oh no. And a lot of people say that because they don't believe in God. I said it because I've been praying about this for years and it hasn't worked for me. If this is the last house on the block, I'm in trouble. And it turned out I had just been telling God my plans. God, make me sober. And I didn't really surrender. I was just trying to go along to get out of trouble.
So how long now have you been at Meadows Behavioral Health?
8 years now. 8 years. And it's been wonderful. They have so many wonderful minds there in addiction and trauma medicine.
Well, how much of your story and your experience with addiction to alcohol, how often does that impact your daily interaction with your patients or your clients, however you refer to them at Meadows there in Arizona?
It works with almost every single person. As the medical guy, I'm what we call neck down, right? I don't do psychiatry, but I provide for medical care and detox and whatnot. So I meet them very first day on their way in the door. And a lot of them have a lot of shame. They have their tail firmly between their legs. And they realized I am not on my best day. So I am able to tell them, hey, I've been there and done that. And there's a way out. And you can just see the muscles relax in their forehead as they finally say, oh, someone that understands. And at the Meadows, they have I think it's 70 or 80% of the people that work there are in recovery, from the top down. And then also, I almost always during my initial H&P, at the end, I offer, do you want to pray? And I've never had anybody say no. Even atheists say, yeah, let's give that a try. And so it's been a fun tool to be part of and to be allowed to do.
Before we continue with this week's episode, here's a special announcement for you. CMDA is excited to announce a new opioid and substance use disorder and treatment course now available in the CMDA Learning Center. The 2023 MATE Act requires prescribers to complete at least 8 hours of continuing education on substance use disorder assessment and treatment before their new DEA renewal. This new course in the Learning Center includes 4 modules that satisfy this requirement for most U.S.-based prescribers. Plus, it is a one-of-a-kind, whole-person addiction course, which integrates faith and science in approaching and treating addiction. And even better, it's free for CMDA members. For more information, visit cmda.org/learning. As Christians, we are called to speak truth into ethical issues and courageously stand up for what's morally right according to our beliefs. But in order to engage others in these discussions with grace and kindness, first we need to arm ourselves with knowledge and understanding of each of these topics. Bridging the Gap, where medical science and church meet, is a small group study developed by expert healthcare professionals. The curriculum is designed to ask difficult, thought-provoking questions as we seek the truth found in God's Word about the ethical issues facing Christians today. Topics include addictions, beginning of life, end of life, gender identity, right of conscience, and sexuality. For more information and to download this free curriculum, visit cmda.org/bridgingthegap. Let's jump right back into this week's episode.
We spend a lot of time in the book talking about medical science, which was helpful to me. I've not been trained in addiction medicine, though there are areas of medicine and surgery which I have a little bit of maybe godly jealousy because of, like, ophthalmology, and people get to see again the spiritual analogies there are numerous, in cardiology, and certainly addiction medicine with slavery and Luke 4 and the Nazareth manifesto of the Messiah coming to rescue those who are enslaved. But we have a tendency to be technicians, and we've got drugs and tools. So I assume that you spend a fair amount of time working with your clients on potential treatments, Suboxone, other treatments that are available to help them, especially with the opioid addiction crisis.
Yes, there's several drugs that are helpful. There's no such thing as a cure. The medical model would love to say, hey, this is a medical problem, we'll fix it, here's your pill. And we don't have that, but it's a biopsychosocial spiritual problem. So medical definitely has a purpose in there. And I personally look at medicine as a tool that God has given us to help people as a response to centuries of prayers and tears of people saying, help my dad, help my wife, help my child. And so it's a tool, but a doctor has to be in cahoots with psychologists and social people that can help, and social determinants of health, and with community. And so the church is perfectly positioned to take on the spiritual and social aspects of addiction treatment.
Well, I love one of your fellow addiction medicine section leaders on your leadership team, Dr. Darren Caparasso from Buffalo, talks about the 4 friends model for that very reason, and the 4 friends who brought the paralytic to Jesus. And that's a similar model to what it takes for an addict to be in recovery, is those individuals in their lives, including the recovery partner that you spend a great deal of time talking about in your book. And so those services must be a part there of your behavioral health center there in Arizona, I guess?
Sure they are. My ministry is separate from my work at the Meadows. They hold room for all religious traditions there, and anybody. It's not specifically a Christian program. But definitely Christianity is deeply there. But my program, I'm trying to involve churches more and equip them to become part of the conversation after people leave treatment. And they start to try to figure out life after their 30-day or 45-day rehab. And churches need to be part. When they send people to AA, they don't realize it, but what they're saying is that Jesus isn't that important to you getting healed, and neither is your church community. Now, I know that's not in the hearts of any of the pastors saying that, and it's not even coming out of their mouths. But I can tell you from someone that sat in those rooms, that's what people are hearing. They're saying, go get better and then come back when you're better. And that's not the way Jesus taught us to
Right,
treat people.
right.
He didn't go into a new city and plant a church. He went into a new city and started healing people. And then the community grew around the miracles.
So in a previous conversation that we've had, you alluded to the challenges that you face to get pastors to engage on this issue. So what's at the heart of that? Because clearly it doesn't even come close to what Jesus modeled. So what is the modern American or Western pastor, what's going through their minds when they think about a ministry to addicts?
This is a fascinating puzzle that I've been given. And I think God picked a good guy for it because I'm terrible at taking no for an answer. But
Praise God, in
they
many
started
respects.
out with, well, we don't understand this higher power language. And I said, okay, here's a book, Jesus. Now why won't you do it? And they said, well, we don't understand it and it's complex. And I go, okay, here's some training videos. You can have them free. And here's my cell phone number. Now why won't you do it? And then it gets a little messier. They a lot of hemming and hawing, and what I suspect honestly is that they don't want to see what's there in front of them. They don't want to see that 20% of the people sitting in their pews have an addiction to one thing or another, or maybe on their staff, or maybe behind their pulpit. And it's a really ugly Band-Aid to rip off, and the wound underneath can be super ugly. So yeah, it's an interesting puzzle. I haven't totally figured it out yet, but it starts and ends with prayer and love for the
Yeah.
people in front of you, and then also doggedness and not letting them push you away and say no.
Well, 99% of them are familiar with Jesus' words in John 8, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. How can our listeners as healthcare professionals and parts of their hundreds, if not thousands of churches across the country, how can they make it easier for their pastor or lay leaders who are involved, would be most involved in their particular church with starting a ministry or growing a ministry? How could our Christians in healthcare do a better job of getting their pastors engaged?
It starts with educating yourself because a lot of doctors have just a very tangential understanding of addiction. It's not super, super complicated. If you understand a little bit of brain disease, you don't have to know all the deep dive genetics and epigenetics of the thing. But understanding that neuroplasticity requires some time to overcome. It's not usually just a light switch. It's more of a rheostat that it takes a while for people to get better. And maybe go to my website or grab a copy of my book or get educated somewhere. And then start having the conversation with the pastors and say, hey, I'll be on the doctor side of it, but you have to be on the social and spiritual side of it. And P.S., there are people in your pews right now with a 10-year AA chip in their pocket, and they're dying to help out at a new ministry.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not taking bandwidth away from, I'm showing them how to use the bandwidth that's already sitting in their churches. And step 12 says, pay it forward. You don't get to keep the blessings to yourself. So they're sitting there waiting for that to happen. And if a pastor were to say, grab a handful of books and put them in the hands and then maybe make one mention from the stage, hey, we got a ministry, I bet they'd be surprised at how many people would show up on a Wednesday night for some healing.
Well, critical aspect of the 12 steps is that big brother or big sister recovery partner with clients or patients that walk them through these steps as a guide. And is there any kind of screening process from AA or in your ministry or any kind of formal training that someone undergoes to actually qualify as a reliable RP or recovery partner?
Oh, no. And, I just use that word to make it separate from sponsorship in AA. But sponsorship has always been just, I've been there and done that. We seem to have similar likes and dislikes. Why don't you come and meet me for coffee once a week? There is some attempt to codify it a little bit, and they're training certified uh, recovery peers and that kind of thing. But 98, I bet, percent of sponsors or recovery partners are just people that have been through that school of hard knocks, and they've been there and done that. It's just, this is the classic discipleship program. The AA program is as classic as it gets. You help me, and then I'll turn around and pull that next guy out of the fire, and he'll pay it forward to the next guy behind him. It's just a beautiful biblical setup.
Well, Don, this was, again, my first introduction, deep dive into the 12 steps, though I'd heard about them for decades. And coming to realize through your book that the first 8 steps are more internal, and then transitioning step 9, more external. I would guess that over time that in the big book and in your experience that there are steps that may be a little bit easier for those who are walking through them, and maybe harder steps. And I wondered if going from 8 to 9 would be particularly difficult. But regardless, is there extra attention given to support in the process that all of you who are experienced and been in this for a number of years know that, wow, this is where the RP has to get, or a group has to get really more engaged with the addict, because this is going to be really hard?
Yeah, each step has its own challenges. I would say we lose the most people on step 4, when we ask them to do a very detailed inventory of all the crummy things that they've done in their life and all the horrible things that have happened to them. It's just very, very difficult to do, because it really triggers a lot of trauma. And without support, a lot of people disappear after you assign them to do step 4. On the other hand, step 1 is surrender. And that's everything. Surrender isn't a thing in addiction treatment. It's the thing. If you can't surrender, you're not going to get well, and you're going to be at strong risk for relapse. And so the very first half of the first step is the only thing you got to do 100% every day. You got to wake up and say, I am powerless over this. And if you can do that every day, it's likely you'll stay sober that day. But not everybody, surrender doesn't come easy. We're very strong-headed, stiff-necked, as it says in the Bible.
Well, you point out later in the book that, okay, maybe it was alcohol, maybe it was opioids, but maybe it's pornography, but you walk through that and you're in a much better place and celebrating the transformation, and then asking God to show you other things that maybe take you back in the steps to step 1 again on a different issue. And you mentioned sugar, and I'm like, oh no, that hits pretty close to home. But what are the list of things that have been classically, besides alcohol and narcotics? Tell our listeners just about the list of things that actually maybe some very unusual things at which people have used the 12 steps toward recovery with Jesus as their higher power.
Mike, if humans can do it, they can be addicted to it. And the fallacy that I think most people have to overcome is that the substance or the behavior is the problem. When I was in what I say in my bottle back in the days, people would say to me, you have a problem with alcohol. And I didn't have the language to say to them back then, alcohol is not my problem. Alcohol is my misguided attempt to solve my problem. Mm-hmm. My problem is this pain and this emptiness in my chest. And I don't know what it is, but I know if I pour alcohol on it, it goes away for a few hours. And good on me if I stop drinking. I don't get a DUI or yell at the kids or whatever, but if I don't figure out what's going on in my heart, I am at risk for scratching that with something else, like sweets or buying too much stuff off of Amazon or whatever. The list is endless, and it can include even healthy stuff like running triathlons or, becoming overly religious or whatever. There's no end to the list of addictions we can participate in, but it almost always comes down to a relationship with God and a sense of unworthiness for God's unconditional love. And if we can just realize that that's a lie that we have told ourselves since the Garden of Eden. They walked in Eden with God every day, and they still said, hey, we're not worthy of this. We better hedge our bet and find out what the rules are so we can become worthy of it and eat the tree. That's humans. That's who we are. And so we have to learn. God says, no, you're not worthy, but I've made a path for you anyway. I've sent my son so that you can become part of our kingdom of heaven. Understanding that it's not the alcohol, it's not the pot, it's not the gambling, it's not the porn. It's about the soul and the heart. That's what counts.
This is powerful stuff. And I have a fond memory, a really good friend of mine that I served with in Kenya for about 12 years, primary care doc from Ohio, Dr. Steve Manchester. We convinced him, Mandy and I did, to write our very first credit-worthy article in the journal, in the CMDA Today magazine. And it was basically on how impactful incorporating spiritual ministry and God's Word is into an opioid addiction clinic dedicated to those who are enslaved to narcotics, and how his clinic compared to others in the same county had such a high success rate because he, during a year home from Kenya, had applied these principles and had not even ever prescribed Suboxone before. But because of I think he called it the three-legged stool, and making God's Word and spiritual ministry and prayer a part of that ministry, his success rate as a newbie in this work in addiction medicine was so much higher than all the experts in the county. And some other guests that we've had on the program before have said it really tests the patience of those secularists who just think that faith is a sham, that all these others who believe in the Bible have a much higher success rate. And I pray that the AA leaders will come to their senses and will see that success, you just can't ignore it from the past. Don, any comments about that?
Well, you know what? AA is theirs to adjudicate the way they wish to. That's why I wrote another tool. If Celebrate Recovery and AA quadrupled tomorrow, they'd still only be scratching the surface. There is plenty of room in this sandbox for us to play and play nicely with each other. I have nothing against AA or Celebrate Recovery. They're all great programs. I'm just adding another tool that especially is situated for churches that don't have a ton of resources for an extra worship service, and they want a real easy way into helping people with recovery and supporting the work that doctors and Christian counselors do. They can just find someone that's got a little experience there and let them share their scars with other people and say, look, you're wounded, but look what God did to my wounds. I'm healed.
Well, we've been talking to Dr. Don Middleton and his book, new book, Dunamis Effect, When Your Higher Power Is Jesus. And as I close, I loved your insight into the key lesson for your life and recovery from alcoholism. It was, you write, keeping myself small so that God has room to make his son ever bigger and bigger in my life, and that you finally understand the meaning of the song that we've all sung hundreds of times in our lives. Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. Little ones to him belong. They are weak, but he is strong. And that certainly made me think of John the Baptist's mantra from John 3:30. He must become greater, I must become less. I want to thank you, Dr. Middleton, for telling us your story openly and transparently. And I hope that our listeners, some of whom may be earlier in their careers or later in their careers, who are right where you were when you admitted to the Osteopathic Medical Association of Arizona, I need help. And I pray that their path will be as blessed and full of grace as yours was.
Well, thank you so much. I just want God to use me however he sees fit.
I know that I'm certainly honored, and I hope you are too, by the way that Dr. Don Middleton, he so transparently and openly shared his struggles with alcoholism, and even more importantly, the way that God has redeemed him and brought him into the field of addiction medicine and helping others. If you're listening to this podcast and you know that you are facing an addiction like we've been discussing today, Friend, I hope that you'll reach out to Dr. Middleton and find out more about how you can overcome and surrender your addiction to Jesus Christ. And for our listeners who have family members going through the struggle of addiction, my prayer is that this book from Dr. Middleton will be a fruitful benefit for you as you work to help them through this journey. You can find your copy of his book, The Dunamis Effect, When Your Higher Power is Jesus, online at Amazon, and we've included a link in our show notes today. This conversation is a great reminder for all of us about CMDA's addiction medicine section. I hope that you'll take this opportunity to engage with this particular section. It exists to prevent and treat addiction and transform lives by God's grace and His love and His power. Through the addiction medicine section, we strive to provide compassionate excellence in all aspects of addiction care, including whole person prevention and treatment, education, advocacy, empowerment of others, research, church and community partnerships, as well as interprofessional collaboration and support. If God is calling you to be a leading change agent in this battle against addiction, as well as the stigmas surrounding addiction, please visit our webpage for the section cmda.org/AMS. By the way, the addiction medicine section is part of a growing list of specialty sections that give our members, some of you out there, the unique opportunity to equip, network, and fellowship with colleagues in your specific specialty. I've personally learned so much by interacting with these professionals who are on the front lines, treating patients with addictions. What they are doing, helping to rescue those enslaved by substances or pornography or gambling, or you heard from Don. There's a long list of masters that have enslaved people. You can find a list of all these specialty sections at cmda.org/specialty sections. And before I forget, the addiction medicine section, they're going to be offering a pre-conference track at the 2025 CMDA National Convention. Right now, it's the best time to register. So here's Jamie with more details for you today.
Are you registered yet for the 2025 CMDA National Convention? We will be gathering just outside St. Louis in St. Charles, Missouri, as we learn about how God is calling us to be a spoke in the wheel for Christ in healthcare. As Dietrich Bonhoeffer famously said, we are not to simply bandage the wounds of victims beneath the wheels of injustice. We are to drive a spoke into the wheel itself. Our speakers include Ambassador Sam Brownback, Aaron Hawley from Alliance Defending Freedom, Professor John Wyatt, and more. You don't want to miss this event, so register now at natcon.cmda.org.
As you heard in my discussion today with Dr. Middleton, there is so much value in making God's Word and guidance from God's Spirit part of our whole person care. And that's why I want to point you to a resource that we've created at CMDA that directly relates to this very topic. It's called Faith Prescriptions. This on-demand video series will teach you to share your faith in ethical as well as appropriate ways with your colleagues and your patients. It will teach you to pray with patients and so much more. There's even a session which focuses on the topic of addiction with Dr. Tim Allen from Milwaukee, who has actually integrated addiction medicine into a general family medicine practice. If you want to get started with this series, which is free for our CMDA members, just visit the CMDA Learning Center by going to cmda.org/learning. Well, next Thursday, I'm going to be joined on the podcast by Vanessa Sivage. She is a most courageous nurse who's made national news because she refused to be silent when the administration and physician leadership of an outlawed gender medicine clinic, and friends, I put that in quotes, a clinic in Houston, Texas, when that clinic continued to provide puberty blockers and hormones to children suffering from gender dysphoria or confusion. Her testimony as an ardent follower of Jesus Christ, I think it's going to be an inspiration to each one of you. Let's close out this week with a couple of my favorite scriptures, in fact, my life verses, which we mentioned during the interview, 2 Timothy chapter 1, verses 6 and 7, which say, "This is why I, Paul, remind you, Timothy, to fan into flames the spiritual gift God gave you when I laid my hands on you, Timothy. For God has not given us a spirit of fear and timidity, but of power, of love, and of self-discipline." Friends, let's call upon that power of Christ this very week. And let's see if we can have a dunamis effect in our communities, on our campuses, in our practices, and in whatever sphere of influence that we find ourselves. As you rely upon the spiritual gifts given to you by our Lord, then you will be empowered as well as emboldened to bring the hope and healing of Jesus Christ to the world. That's what matters to CMDA, and CMDA matters. We'll see you next week, friends, with Vanessa Sivage, God willing.
Thanks for listening to CMDA Matters. If you would like to suggest a future guest or share a comment with us, please email cmdamatters@cmda.org. And if you like the podcast, be sure to give us a 5-star rating and share it on your favorite social media platform. This podcast has been a production of Christian Medical and Dental Associations. The opinions expressed by guests on this podcast are not necessarily endorsed by Christian Medical and Dental Associations. CMDA is a nonpartisan organization that does not endorse political parties or candidates for public office. The views expressed on this podcast reflect judgments regarding principles and values held by CMDA and its members, and are not intended to imply endorsement of any political party or candidate.